Thank you. So I'm very happy and excited to be teaching for my Jewish learning for my first time. I'm in the Boston area and it's kind of raining, drizzling. It's a little too warm for snow, but here we are. And so Monday this past week, January 27th, was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I learned that, and maybe you learned this too, that there are only about 50 surviving survivors who are still alive. So it's going to be in our lifetime that there won't be any more living witnesses. And so it makes me feel really aware about how urgent it is to record the testimony of those last survivors. And I was thinking about this while I was studying this week's Torah portion, Parashat Bo, which is also about preserving the record of one of the most dramatic and consequential events in the history of the Jewish people. So I'll be relating the Exodus story to the Passover Seder, the festival dinner that we have at the beginning of the holiday. And I'm just curious, show of hands, you can just like wave. Just to get an idea, please wave if you're familiar with Passover, if you've been to a Seder, just to get a general idea. So, Mara, how many people do you think are waving right now,
Not
approximately?
everyone, and we hope they'll join us at my Jewish Learning Seder this year. But many folks are waving and nodding enthusiastically.
Oh, excellent. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so recounting this Torah portion, and I'm using that word on purpose, recounting, which we're about to do, it's like telling a story about telling a story about telling a story. We're going to encounter a number of verses in this portion that sound, for all the people who waved at least, they will sound very familiar because they are quoted in the Haggadah, which is the book that we use to guide us through the Passover Seder, the dinner that we have at the beginning of the holiday, which the book contains retelling of the Exodus story and prompts for a number of rituals that we do at the Passover Seder. So as we proceed, I invite you to think about three things. One, why is it so important that we continue to repeat this story? Two, what do you recognize in this week's portion, Parashat Bo, this Exodus text, that reminds you of Passover? And three, we're going to pay attention to the uses of a particular Hebrew verb, one of my favorites. It's the verb to exit or go forth or go out. The root of this verb winds its way throughout this Torah portion and beyond. And it's the same root that gives us the noun Exodus, which is the name of the book of the Torah that we're currently in. In Hebrew, it's Shemot. In English, it's Exodus. And we're going to, one example of using it as a noun is the Hebrew phrase Yitziat Mitzrayim. Yitziat, that's from this verb. And that means the exodus from Egypt. So I want to share something with you. Let's see, here it is. Sharing is not turned on. But
It
no,
is
it is.
now.
Great,
Great.
great, thank you. So this is the verb that I was just mentioning. Yud Tzadi Aleph can mean to exit, to go forth, to go out, as I said. And here is a form of that verb. Here's the Yud, the Tzadi, and the Aleph. A couple other letters were added in there. And Yitziat Mitzrayim is how we say the exodus from Egypt. And the word Yitziah, an exit, the noun, is in modern Hebrew, means the same thing. So I wanted to share this picture with you of an exit sign in Israel. And you can see there's the word Yitziah, and there's your Yud, your Tzadi, and your Aleph with a couple other things added in between. And so I want to say that today's Torah study is brought to you by this verb, the Hebrew verb latzet, and the plague of darkness. Okay. In last week's Torah portion, Va'era, we read about the first 7 of the 10 plagues. And in this week's portion, Bo, we will finish the list by reading about the last 3 plagues, which are the plague of locusts, which is arbeh in Hebrew. And if you're thinking about taking a drop of wine out of your glass while you're sitting at the Passover Seder, you know, we're in the middle of that list, approximately the middle. So we'll read about the plague of locusts, the plague of darkness, as I mentioned, choshech in Hebrew, and the plague of the slaying of the firstborn, makat bechorot. Here in Parashat Bo, we also, besides the plagues, we're going to read the instructions for how to observe and celebrate the holiday of Passover. And this Torah portion is when our sacred calendar begins. It's the first mention of observing Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. So before we dive in, though, I want to point out something from last week's Torah portion, from Exodus chapter 6. So I'm going to put that on the screen, and if somebody would be willing to read aloud in English a couple of verses, maybe Mara, you can find a volunteer for us while I'm sharing.
No problem.
Here we go.
I see Barbara, so we'll ask Barbara to unmute. Oh, I lost you. Just a second. This is all me, not Barbara. Okay, there we go.
So where do you want to read from?
Oops, sorry, I've shared the wrong thing. Just a moment. We are going to look at something from Exodus chapter 6. Let me reshare. I was showing this week's Torah portion. But from last week, we had the famous 4 expressions of redemption. Hi, Barbara. So if you would please read aloud in English 3 verses on this page. I'll scroll when we get down there.
So should I start with therefore?
Yes, please.
Therefore, say to the children of Israel, I am Adonai. I will bring you out from beneath the burdens of Egypt. I will rescue you from servitude to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with great acts of judgment. I will take you for me as a people, and I will be for you as a God. And you shall know that I am Adonai, your God, who brings you out from beneath the burdens of Egypt. Do you want me to keep going? I will take you for, oh, I read that. Do you want me to, I will bring you into the land over which I lifted my hand in an oath to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession, I, Adonai.
Thank you. That was great. So let's think about the first question that I mentioned, which is about repeating the Exodus story. So as we look at these 4 expressions of redemption, I'm going to point them out. They're in bold. The first one is, I will bring you out. And that's right here. And this is from our verb. That's why I highlighted it in red, vehotseti. So we already said that verb means to go forth or to go out, but in a different construction in Hebrew, it can mean to cause someone or something else to do the action of the verb. So I will cause you to go forth, we could say. So that's the first thing that God says, make this promise to the Israelites in Egypt. The second one is, I will rescue. So there's rescue. That's vehitsalti. I will redeem you. Viga'alti. And the fourth one is here in verse 7, I will take you, vilakachti. And you can notice also in verse 7 here that we have the word hamotzi, the one who brings out. And that's also from our verb. The word hamotzi might be familiar to you from another context. You can think about that. And then there's actually the verb I will bring you, veheveti. So those are the expressions of redemption. And because of these four, that's actually why we have 4 cups of wine at the Passover Seder. It comes from this. So let's get to this week's Torah portion. So I'm going to stop that share, and we're going to be looking on Sefaria. I'm guessing a lot of people here are familiar with this amazing free online Jewish library there, which has more texts continually being added to it. I rely on it a lot. And here we are at the beginning of Parashat Bo, chapter 10 of Exodus. And this portion, by the way, is the 3rd one in the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot. Okay, so I'm going to read the first verse here in English. Adonai said to Moshe, to Moses, "Come to Pharaoh, for I have made his heart and the heart of his servants heavy with stubbornness, in order that I may put these my signs among them. And in order that you may recount in the hearing of your child and of your child's child how I have been capricious with Egypt and my signs which I have placed upon them, that you may know that I am Adonai." So the portion is called Bo because that's the first significant new word in this portion. Most Torah portions are named this way. In fact, so are the 5 books of the Torah, named by the first meaningful Hebrew word. So what does Bo mean? You can see that this translator, who is Everett Fox, it's the verb lavo, which we often translate as to come, although many translators translate it instead as what we might expect more, as Adonai said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh." And there are a lot of different ideas, opinions about how to translate this Bo, and does it really mean come? Is God saying we'll go together, instead of you going, I'm going to send you. God could be saying, I will come with you. Or it could be that, especially in biblical Hebrew, this verb is often used to mean to enter, like to come join. And there's some other really interesting commentators out there, interesting comments about other ways to interpret this come to Pharaoh. So we can talk about that later if we have time. In the second verse, especially thinking about our first question about why it's important to retell this story, notice that one of the reasons God says that God has hardened Pharaoh's heart and putting these signs, and in order that you may recount in the hearing of your child and your child's child. And let's just look at the Hebrew of that for a moment. Tisaper, you will tell a story. It's the same root as the word for book, sefer, like Sefer Torah. It's, if you know the Hebrew word sipur, comes from this same verb, which is a story. So this recounting is retelling the story in the ears, be'oznei. And let's look at vincha uven vincha, your child and the child of your child. So that's really putting us in mind of thinking about the future after us, what comes after us, and what we want to tell to the next generation and generations after that. We're reaching into the future. Okay, I'm going to scroll a little bit now to verse 6. They will, so talking about the locusts now, and this is Moses quoting God, who's giving a warning about what's to come in plague number 7, which is going to be the plague of locusts. They will fill your houses, the houses of all your servants, and the houses of all Egypt, as neither your fathers nor your fathers' fathers have seen from the day of their being upon the soil until this day. He turned and went out from Pharaoh. And went out. Oh, it's our verb again. And here it is, vayetse, same verb. And notice that we just switched from thinking about the future, your child and the child of your child. Now we're talking about the past. Your father's fathers have never seen anything like this. I'd like to invite questions or comments if anyone would like to make an observation or ask a question so far. Have anybody? Mara, if you could call on someone, or we can just keep going.
No problem. As always, there's some chatter happening, but I think it's good to keep going.
Keep going? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're going to look at the actual plagues as they're described in this portion. And as we read, notice the theme of darkness, the descriptions of light and dark, of day and night. And the 9th plague is the plague of darkness, but we're going to be starting here with the 8th plague, which is the plague of locusts. But even in the plague of locusts, we're going to be thinking about darkness. So let's go to verse 14. And I chose this theme partly just because it's my own personal favorite of the plagues. If you can have a favorite plague, not that I love the darkness exactly, but just the way, well, we'll see how it's described in our portion. Okay, could we have another volunteer to read in English, verses 14 and 15? Mara, if you can.
Yeah, I believe, Jenny, you're unmuted.
Yes, yes. Okay, the locust horde ascended over all the land of Egypt. It came to rest upon all the territory of Egypt, exceedingly heavy. Before it, there was no such locust horde as it, and after it, there'll be no such again. It covered the aspect of all the earth, and the earth became dark. It consumed all the plants of the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Nothing at all green was left of the trees and of the plants of the field throughout all the land of Egypt.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that. So I want to point out a couple of things, particularly here in verse 15. So we saw in English, this horde covered the aspect of all the earth, and the earth became dark. And in the Hebrew over here, we have a verb that means to become dark. In English, it takes several words to say that. I guess we could say darken, but here's the verb, va tech shach. And the last 3 letters here, the chet, the shin, and the chaf, are the same letters as for the noun choshech, meaning darkness. So the earth became dark. And I wanted to tell you a couple of commentators' comments on this verse. Ibn Ezra, who was a 12th century commentator who lived most of his life in Spain and later moved to England, where he died, says that when we see the earth became dark, it's because the locusts blotted out the sun. That's a lot of locusts blotting out all the light. And we're getting to the idea of darkness here. So we're going to now go to the next plague, the actual plague of darkness. So in verse 21, Adonai said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the heavens and let there be darkness over the land of Egypt, so that they will feel darkness." This is the part that has always caught my attention. They will feel darkness. Many translators translate these last two words instead of "they will feel darkness," is that it was a darkness that can be touched. We have the word for darkness twice here. Here it is, choshech, the first time, there will be darkness, or let there be darkness. And then we have this interesting verb, viyamesh choshech. Viyamesh is not completely clear. There are a number of different translations. One is about feeling, meaning groping, the way maybe a blind person, or for anybody who cannot see anything, is feeling around in the dark. Another possibility is brought to us from Rashbam, another 12th century commentator who lived in France, who says the verb refers actually to a verb that means to get darker, to increase in darkness, that the darkness of night would grow deeper and gloomier for a long time and would not brighten again for 3 days. So let's look at the next verse. Moses stretched out his hand toward the heavens, and there was gloomy darkness throughout all the land of Egypt for 3 days. 3 days. And here we have the word choshech, but here it's attached to a new word regarding the darkness, afela, choshech afela, gloomy darkness. Ibn Ezra said, in the Atlantic Ocean, there sometimes comes darkness so thick that one cannot tell the difference between day and night, and this may last up to 5 days. I have been there many times, said Ibn Ezra. And I found that particularly interesting because if you think of where Jews lived at different points in time, for example, in ancient times, the major large body of water that people knew about was the Mediterranean, and there are references in the Talmud to the Great Sea, the Yam Hagadol is the Mediterranean. We get this comment from someone who's familiar with the Atlantic Ocean, and I assume it's because the Atlantic is overall colder than the Mediterranean. So this kind of thick, foggy, afela darkness is something that, is exotic from the faraway ocean that is the Atlantic, that you wouldn't see if you only knew the Mediterranean. Okay, continuing with this plague of darkness. No one could see his brother, literally, and no one could arise from his spot for 3 days. And notice, by the way, that verse 22 mentions 3 days, and so does verse 23 here, 3 days. But for all the children of Israel, there was light in their settlements. So Ramban, a 13th century commentator who lived in Spain and Israel also, says this gloomy darkness, this gloominess, was not merely the absence of sunlight, but it was a thick darkness, a dense fog that maybe descended from the sky, that it extinguished every light, that it was so thick that if you tried to light a fire, a candle, it would be immediately extinguished. And Midrash says that the fact that each of these two verses mentions 3 days means that altogether this plague lasted for 6 days and became so palpable that the Egyptians literally could not move. And the commentator Rashi, 12th century rabbi in France, interprets this midrash about the palpability of the darkness. Our text says literally, "Lo kamu ish mitachtav," a person could not rise from where they sat or where they were down, arise from his spot, as the text says. Rashi interprets the midrash to mean that one who was sitting when the darkness came could not stand, and one who was standing could not sit. It's like the darkness was so thick that the Egyptians, were paralyzed, totally paralyzed. Okay, Mara, is there anything in the chat that we should mention, or see if we have time at the end to come back?
There's lots of questions about how long each plague lasted, and if there's symbolism of the timing related to that. But I think folks are there's lots of midrash in the chat, as always.
Okay.
But wherever you want to go, we'll follow you. Oh, we have some hands raised. Do you?
Let me just respond to the comments that you just mentioned. There's a tradition that each plague lasted 7 days, but as we can see here already, it's not necessarily 7, and we don't know exactly. And it's interesting to think that some were longer, some were shorter. Oh yeah, I was going to mention about the plague of locusts, which came after the plague of hail, that the hail, which was in last week's Torah portion, broke or destroyed all the crops, like all the plants, all trees, vegetation, everything was broken by the hail. And then when we got to the plague of locusts, it said that they chewed all the vegetation, down to the ground and destroyed it. So I know there is at least one comment that perhaps several months passed between the plague of hail and the plague of locusts, so that some of the vegetation might have started growing again after the hail that was then destroyed by the locusts. So that's just one, another question. I don't know the answer, but how much did the plagues just come, like, one right after the other, boom, boom, boom? Was there time in between? It's a really interesting question. So I'd actually, at this point, I'd like to move on to chapter 11. And looking at the first verse here, this is a prelude to the 10th and final plague, which is the slaying of the firstborn. In this verse, God is describing it, telling Moshe about it ahead of time, rather dramatically. I'll read this. Adonai said to Moshe, "I will cause one more blow to come upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will send you free from here." Remember, there's been, we haven't talked about it today, but there's been lots of back and forth in Pharaoh's saying, okay, already, I can't stand these plagues. Yes, you can go. But then either hardening his heart himself, or God causing his heart to be hardened, changing his mind, saying, nope, stay here, or a few of you can go, but you have to come right back. So here God is saying, this time when he sends you free, it is finished. He will drive you out from here. Okay. Now we here in verse 4, we have Moshe quoting what Adonai said. Moshe said, "Thus says Adonai, in the middle of the night, I will go forth throughout the midst of Egypt." You know what's coming. I will go forth. Let's see. Ani yotze. There's our verb again. I will go forth throughout the midst of Egypt. Every firstborn shall die throughout the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the maid who is behind the handmill, and every firstborn of beast. Then there shall be a cry throughout all the land of Egypt, the like of which has never been, the like of which will never be again. Interesting, sending us both into the past and the future about this cry. We are going to now go ahead to chapter 12. At the beginning of this chapter, there's an interruption in the narrative. We learn about the setting of the calendar according to the new moon and the commandment to observe Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month, the new moon. This is when our sacred calendar gets started. And this is the first commandment to the Israelites and later the Jewish people as a community, as a group. This is the first commandment, to observe Rosh Chodesh. And of course, the month that is happening, that is starting with the new moon at this point, is the month of Nisan. And we know that in the Torah, the month of Nisan, or the spring month, is called the first month. And that's the month that Passover occurs in. So it's just interesting to think about the Torah calling this the first month, which we might think would be Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. But when we learn about that, where it is in the calendar, the month of Tishrei is the 7th month. So we start our new year, our human new year, on the 7th month. But the first Rosh Chodesh, and the month that is called the first month, is right here in the spring. Okay, so let's go to verse 7. An instruction about what the Israelites are supposed to do during this plague, or just ahead of this plague happening. They are to take some of the blood and put it onto the 2 posts and onto the lintel, onto the houses in which they eat it. And the eating is the, we sometimes call it the Passover lamb. We had some description of go out, every family or a group of families, and acquire lambs. And there were some description of exactly what kind of lamb, and to make sure that everyone has this ahead of time. And then the lambs are to be killed. And that's where this blood is coming from. And it's interesting to think about, actually, just sort of architecturally for a moment, the lintel and the 2 posts. So if, in case anyone doesn't know exactly what a lintel is, I read, it's the, well, in Hebrew here, it's the hamashkof. It's what goes horizontally above a doorway. It's a load-bearing part of a structure. Could be wood. These days, it's sometimes made of concrete. And this word mashkof has a root in it, shin kuf fe, which is related to words that have something to do with view or point of view. You might know the word hashkafa or mishkafaim in modern Hebrew, sunglasses. So from the top of the door, there's like a view of things. And then the word for the posts, or doorposts, as we often call them, are hamizuzot. Nowadays, when we speak of a mezuzah, it's something that we put on the doorpost, but the actual meaning of the word mezuzah is the doorpost itself. In verse 8 here, we have, and they are to eat the flesh of the lamb on that night, roasted in fire, and matzot, with bitter herbs, they are to eat it. So I'm assuming that for people who waved their hands at the beginning, these sudden reference to matzot and bitter herbs is familiar, comes in our Passover Seder, comes right from here. And let's look a couple verses later at verse 13. Now the blood will be a sign for you upon the houses where you are. This is Adonai speaking. I will see the blood, and I will pass over you, so that the blow will not become a bringer of ruin to you when I strike down the land of Egypt. And pass over here in the Hebrew, ufasachti, we have pe samech chet. That's the root of the word Pesach, our name of the holiday. It's a Hebrew verb that could mean to pass over, and that's why we call the holiday by that name. Some commentators say that that's a little bit of a mistranslation, that Pasach could mean something more like to skip, to avoid, to hop over. And some even translate it as to protect. And we do sometimes refer to that first night of the holiday and of this, and when we do the Seder, as a night of protection, when God protected us. So I want to be mindful of the time. There's a lot more to say about that verb and about this whole story. But I want to just read verse 14 here. Now, this day shall be a reminder for you. You are to celebrate it as a pilgrimage celebration for Adonai throughout your generations. As a law for the ages, you are to celebrate it. We have le dorotechem, your generations, and chukat olam, a permanent, eternal, everlasting law. And then finally, we're going to just look at one more verse, 26. And think about what we read near the beginning. So here in chapter 12, verse 26, and it will be when your children say to you, what does this service mean to you? Does that sound familiar? That's in the Haggadah. It's actually the question asked by the one of the four sons that we sometimes call the wicked son, asks that question. Okay, and then finally, I do want to jump to chapter 13, verse 8. And we will end with this one. And you are to tell your child on that day, saying, it is because of what Adonai did for me when I went out of Egypt. And we can see the first two words here, v'higadta levincha, and you will tell or recount to your child. At the beginning, we had, you will tell the story to saper, in the ears of your child and the child of your child. And here we just have this simple two words. If you look on the cover of your Passover Haggadah this year, some Haggadot actually have this as a sort of subtitle, Haggadah Shel Pesach, a Passover Haggadah. Some of them say, V'higadta levincha, right there on the cover, and you shall tell it to your child. So, any questions in our remaining time? Comments, burning questions?
I think folks are surprised that we're in January and feeling excited for Pesach. So thank you for that. There's lots of questions about how this informs our Passover practice. I am getting a lot of questions about why you chose this translation. There are many available on Sefaria. And so I will leave you with all of those thoughts and 3 minutes.
Yeah, so on the question of, here it is January, or tomorrow it will be February, but winter. And we still have other holidays coming up before Passover, right? We have Tu B'Shvat. We're in the month of Shvat. Today is the second day of the month of Shvat. And then in the month of Adar, we have Purim. So we're several months away from Passover at this point. So it's a great question. I remember when I first was learning about this, and I had the same question, and I was in a Torah study group last week where somebody else brought up the same question. Why don't we read this when we're closer to the Passover holiday? And the short answer is that we have two different cycles going on. One is our calendar cycle of the solar year, you could say, when the holidays fall. And then our other cycle is our cycle of Torah readings, going through the Torah and reading a portion every week. And they don't all match up with what is being described. The holidays don't all match up with where we are in the cycle of readings. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but why did I choose this translation? It's a great question. I toyed with actually mixing it up a bit. Everett Fox, whose translation this is his translation is known for being possibly the most literal translation of the Hebrew. He tried to preserve not exactly the poetic aspect of the Hebrew, but to give us a feel in English of really what the Hebrew words are actually saying. I know that this translation is less familiar to a lot of people, and in a way, that's sort of also why I chose it, just to, again, to shake things up and give you a chance to see one that you might be less familiar with, and to get you to ask that question, just as we use the Haggadah and the rituals on Passover to get people to ask questions. So I love it.
Amazing. And I know, Jack, you've had your hand raised for a really long time, and I always love your comments. I'm going to put Natasha's email in the chat. So if anyone would like to share their thoughts, they're welcome to either send her an email or continue to write them in the chat. As I said, there's always lovely midrash there. And before I turn it over to you, Natasha, to leave us with a parting thought and intention as we walk into Shabbat, I'm going to share in the chat again about our class, and we hope that people will consider that. But we learned a lot. We spent a lot of time looking at roots and verbs and nouns. What would you like for the folks on this call to take away from this?
Great question. I guess I want to go back to our verb that that brought us to this Torah portion today. If we had had more time, I was actually going to lead us in a brief round of Dayenu, because it starts with, as you'll recall, Ilu hotzi anu mi Mitzrayim Dayenu. Hotzianu brought us out. Let's think about this Shabbat, how we are no longer in Egypt. We still struggle with how to be free, but thanks to this verb, we can understand a lot of things about going forth. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.